good in order to come to a more interlocking sense of feminism, so that it isn't feminism plus an understanding of African American or Chicana or American Indian or other kinds of positionalities. So at this point, it's hard for me to say where I am because the term emerges really describes where I am. I'm still on my way out.
Given those responses, then, can you talk about how feminism differs for women based on race, ethnicity, national origin, socioeconomic status, religion, citizenship, or any other kind of factors that might play in there?
Okay. I can answer that. Well, the way that women of color or women from different national origins or white women experience feminism, or how feminism is different for these women, is from the various groups rest basically, I feel, on their social location, on the interlocking structures of power, privilege, and oppression, and other aspects of one's identity. The everyday experiences of women different dramatically by how our identities are otherwise constituted. And I don't think that we could separate a woman's identity from those multiple levels of identities, be it race, nationality, etc. When we look at women from African countries, and I've done some studies and readings and traveled to Africa countries, that different perspective is not just about the struggle for women's freedom, but also is tied into the struggle against patriarchy, is tied into the struggle of neocolonialism, is tied in the struggle to imperialism. And because there are multiple identities, inform those kind of views in which they engage in struggle.
It sounds as if you're laying out, and we're going to talk about Western feminism more specifically, but that Western practices colonialism, and this is going back to much colonialism, European colonialism, that sort of shapes the context in which we grow and emerge as women, and thus the feminisms that emerge or don't emerge based on other more present needs.
I think I agree with that.
Is this working? I think for a lot of white feminists, there's a sense that the category has to cohere. And so the question itself is actually, it articulates that assumption that the category has to cohere, whereas if you look at the multiplicities of feminism and womanisms and Chicana positionalities that are not necessarily named feminists, but have some political pro-women goals, then the category becomes much more messy. What it means to be a mestiza, lesbian, Chicana is not comfortably within the category of feminism as some kind of universal description. And I think a lot of white feminists are resisting that. They're saying, well, feminism is a description, we need to build on it. And I think instead we need to be subtracting from that, moving away from that, layering that, but anything but sort of building a wall of feminism and then having everybody be a different brick.
I guess I really hesitate to ask the question and how we're respond how we are different, because I can only speak for myself. Because otherwise then we just begin to essentialize experiences, because I do believe that there are a lot of white women who don't have access to capital because of their poverty or their literacy. So I'm just going to speak from my perspective on what I think. When I go out as a Chicana, I'm not just working in the community for women's issues. I'm working for my people. I'm working for people of color, not just Chicanos or Latinos. I'm fighting for justice for everyone. I am grounded in my ethnicity, and my sense of solace and belonging comes from my ethnic background. That my motivation to change the world is not just to protect a particular group of people, nor a particular gender or sexual preference.
This is a tough question for me. I actually wrote something to try and answer it. In my own view, Western intellectual tradition has been quite dominant in shaping and controlling the discourse on human rights since the 18th century. And within this worldview, it's not surprising that the formulation of human rights or women's rights has been labeled as colonialist by non-Western countries, which one you just mentioned. What I have found is that the assumption of a lot of Western feminism is that universal human rights or women's rights discourse can adapt to and transcend any cultural distinction. This is not to say that if something is a cultural tradition or belongs to a particular culture, race, religion, that it is above criticism. In fact, then there's some people within those different cultures that may be criticizing it themselves. But I think we have to be very careful as to who has the right to decide certain things, who has the right to frame the discourse on women's rights, and does anyone have the right to do that? I think in my own research on female circumcision, one of the issues that I have found, being from Africa and working with many African women who practice this cultural practice, is that the distrust of female circumcision eradication agendas is based on the premise that communities have viewed feminist discourse on the practice as generally being paternalistic, ethnocentric, and racist.
That raises a number of questions, and I guess a number of ones that I really struggle with, especially, well, not especially today, but always, and that is that how then do we take Western feminism, or do we take Western feminism, recognize its grounding in whiteness and its reliance on white values, so that it can respond to, or perhaps maybe just listen to, other groups around the world and within our own country, and some of the very real material realities, the very real circumstances that women find themselves in. Can you talk about the role of Western feminism? Does it impose? Should it impose? Can it not? Can it afford not to impose?
I guess it's not really a matter of imposing white values on other people. I think it's more a matter of legitimizing other voices. I certainly don't feel like white feminists are imposing their values on me, but I don't always feel like they want to hear what I have to say. So in that sense, I don't think that it's just the white women who are, monopolizing what it means to be a feminist, because certainly I've read several studies by black women who only talk about black and white issues, who do the same type of excluding, any type of discourse that reinforces the white and black binary, I think silences others. And it's quite frequent. I mean, you can look at critical race theory literature or critical white studies, and more often than not, you will see the discussion about black and white issues. It doesn't address my experience. It doesn't address Asian experiences. It doesn't address lesbian experiences. So I think that to suggest that white feminists are imposing their values then kind of connotes that we're just these passive things that are just waiting for things to happen to us. And I think there's a lot of critical research by Chicana scholars who are making an argument and addressing their lives living betwixt and between on the borderlands. It's an emerging theory. It just hasn't gained momentum yet. So by, I think, suggesting that white Western feminism is imposing, I think it doesn't do very much to recognize that there is work, and very important work out there that's available for people who are really interested in hearing other voices.
We did something really specific, and some of you may know that along the U.S.-Mexico border over the past few years, especially with the rise of factories. There have been a number of fairly brutal deaths of working Mexican women who are fleeing the rural countryside and coming to the border because they need to work. But in doing so, they're violating cultural norms of what means to be a woman. My response to that is partly, I think, grounded in my training in Western feminism, and yet at the same time, there's a part of me that says, well, we have to respond. And if part of me responds from that place of Western feminism, is that wrong? And this is just one incident. I'm sure everybody, I know Kadisha's work on female circumcision would be another example. There's all kinds of practices within the U.S. and around the world of fairly extreme violence against women. Can we use Western feminism to intervene in that? And if we do, what are the dangers we invoke in doing so? And I'm making up new questions. I'm cheating.
I think that that's a place that a lot of us find ourselves in, is we have a certain amount of training, and we can't just give it up. We can't just start over from someplace else. So whether it's our academic training or our political training, we're struggling with both using that in some way and problematizing it, trying to rework it, trying to back away from it. And I think that is, at least for me right now, all I can do is try to use it, but use it tentatively. Use it while also questioning, because I don't know what it would mean to just throw out all of the insights and skills and disciplinary background I have, but I don't want that to not be a question that could be asked. I made a note about this. Somebody writing about sociology said, the question is not whether we will write the lives of people as social scientists, that is what we do, but how and for whom. And I think that saying the question is not to say, well, we're not going to ask that question. We can never ask that question. I think we always have to ask that question about whether it's about Western feminism or about our disciplines or whatever. But I don't know that we can just start by throwing it out.
I think that Western feminism failed to really recognize that there are multiple forms of feminism coming from different people's social location. And that question that you raised made me think about, there was like one of the conferences in women's conferences that had taken place, I think like in 75, and 80, etc. And one of the things that Western feminism or feminists wanted to really address as it related to so-called third world women was the whole issue of circumcision and imposing Western values in terms of how they look at that whole issue and not taking in consideration, like you said, the cultural context in which women from third world may view circumcision, and that being in a patriarchal society, there are other issues in which they need to address, such as imperialism and neocolonialism, and dealing with female circumcision might not be such a pressing issue to address or overthrow.
And one of my fears along with this is that sometimes we look at things like female circumcision and from sometimes the horror of it blinds us to the violence within the U.S. against women. 1 in 4 women raped. That we can see one as almost barbaric and not the other. It says something about failings, I think, of Western feminism.
I just wanted to add, you were talking about something, it reminded me something right now about what's happening in Afghanistan. I happen to be a Muslim woman as well. And in Afghanistan, I was watching, there was a thing by the UN or something on television last week, for Women's Week. And there, as I watched this show on television, there are a number of documentaries, and I hear a lot of women saying, you know, it's so great to see these women not wearing the hijab or not wearing the covering. Finally, there is some kind of liberation. Well, my mother wears hijab. I come from a family, and there's a sister who's wearing hijab in the room, and you know what? They're liberated. They have rights. They're not oppressed to that degree. And certainly in cases they may be, but in many cases they're not. And when that dialogue happens within women that if you don't wear your covering, Afghanistan is now being liberated because these women are taking off their scarf. Well, my mom wears a scarf, most of my family does. And she's got the power in the house, but that's part of her prayer. So that's part of the discourse that I was saying about how we language that we need to be careful of.
And how we need to turn the reflective eyes on wearing high heel shoes that are slightly uncomfortable. I'm sorry, I don't remember that.
Well, I always have something to say. I think that this current concern with third world women about circumcision is really reflective of the way women who don't listen to other women function. Because I remember reading about the second wave of feminism and how it was that African American women were struggling just to be treated as human beings, right? And there was such tension amongst white women and black women because white women couldn't understand why they weren't fighting for civil rights. And African American women couldn't explain why it was that they were fighting for human rights. I need to be a human being, conceived as a human being first before I can start working towards civil rights. And yet, for some reason, members of the dominant group do think that they know what's in our best interests. So we shouldn't be thinking about, struggling to make things better for our Latino men and our African American men, because we should be thinking simply about the feminist agenda. And this is what I would critique about white feminists, is that they often do not listen because they think that they know better than we know about our own experiences, and that simply is a reflection of whiteness and of white supremacy at work. So I think I'm very troubled when white feminists start working about what's going on over there, because that's very easy to do when they won't even listen to what we're telling them here. So that's why my activism is locally, and I'm willing to talk. I don't have anything against feminists. I will support their agenda as much as possible. The only problem I know with feminists is when they think that they can speak for me.
To go back to Carolina's point earlier about Western feminism can't really impose values on other groups because those groups are not necessarily going to be passive about accepting them. I think maybe if we reframe the question in terms of imposing white and Western values in a dialogue, because I think that is how we do it. When there's supposed to be a dialogue, it's not just a question of whether we listen, it's how we listen, and we're not very good at listening. We don't know even what that would mean. And so to go back to the title of the panel, self-righteousness, one of the ways we do that is we say, well, speak so that I can listen. And I can't hear you. I'm hearing your anger. I can't hear your message. Or we keep demanding information. We demand that somebody explain it more because it doesn't really make sense to us. And I think that academia is very complicit in this. We have ways of talking that recenter whites as reasonable. So we say things like, I'm willing to be persuaded. And that positions us as reasonable, as open-minded, as fair, and at the same time as judges, as authorities, as arbiters. So if I'm persuaded, good enough. You made a good point. I'm back in my seat as the judge.
So then, what are some of the underlying things that are separating white women and women of color on the issue of feminism, or not the term feminism, on gender equity, social justice, politics? What separates? What are the forces that separate us?
I can think of, I guess if I have a feminist group to pick on, it would have to be liberal feminists and their urge to be equal to white men. Because I believe that this need to position themselves on an equal basis with white males has severe consequence material consequences for women of color and other people. The example that comes to mind is Cheryl Hopwood in the affirmative action case at the University of Texas, you know, in her effort, you know, to get rid of affirmative action because the white female argument is, I want to be hired by merit, all right, without acknowledging that white women have been the largest beneficiaries of affirmative action to begin with. And so now all of a sudden they don't want to have the benefits of affirmative action, and so they want to be equal and be considered as individuals, even though that probably won't happen in our lifetime. Then that need to be equal with white males has consequences for people of color who have not yet completely benefited from affirmative action, since affirmative action has just simply been ineffective in certain cases because we can't get rid of white supremacy within the educational system. We can't somehow or another reach people the way they talk about, you know, like, well, we have to hire a woman, or we have to hire a person of color. I was recently invited to do a colloquium at Texas A&M, and the response by a professor, an English professor who was formerly on my committee was, oh, they must be doing the affirmative action work. You know, my reaction was to say, no, thanks to white women, they don't have affirmative action in Texas anymore. So that's the issue I have, and I believe that that need for equality with white men is what separates, in my mind, white women from other women.
Part of what separates the groups, I mean, some of the forms of separation have to do with white ignorance or white normalization, white listening habits, but part of it has to do with just our positionality, so that as a white woman and as an Anglo, I get credit if I teach a course on whiteness theory, if I teach a course on African American epistemologies, if I say anything anti-racist, then I get credit for being anti-racist. If I can speak Spanish, I get credit for being bilingual. But if I were Chicana, then I would probably lose credit for being bilingual. It would look like I was limited English proficient. If I'm anti-racist and I'm Chicana or I'm African American, then people assume that that's some lack of objectivity on my part, that I need to take that position, some subjective investment. And so even as we work on differences in terms of understanding, in terms of outlook, in terms of habit, that position doesn't change. We still get different kinds of credit for the work we do.
Yeah, I just want to echo what Audrey said by saying that one of the fundamental differences is that white women do not experience individual and institutionalized forms of racism. And so, whereas women of color recognize, you know, that racism is real in our life as it intersects with gender as well as class, etc. And we also are aware that the men in our lives, the men of color in our lives, also experience the same types of oppression, racial oppression, that we experience. And so for women of color, one of the forms of our struggle is to struggle against racism. And I don't think that white women would struggle against racism as vehemently as women of color do. So that is one of the things that separates.
And potentially then we also have separations among us as women of color in our affiliations with feminism. Any thoughts on what barriers exist between women of color, feminists of color? I mean, I think you sort of allude to class might be one.
Right, class,
Financial privileged feminists might have less ability to support programs or policies to rectify class differentials.
right.
So, do you all experience those tensions? Here, do you experience tensions between, as women of color, between you and white women? How about amongst yourselves as women of color and feminists of color, if you identify as
Do we experience tensions between women of color?
Yeah.
I think I see myself as having a much more collegiate relationship or an alliance with women of color than I do perhaps with liberal white feminists, because of one of the underlying forms of alliance would be issues of racism and gender oppression, etc.
I It depends. I had experience recently with a woman who's going to Africa and doing work in the same field I am, and she's white, Protestant woman, born here, bred here, and is in Uganda. And she went to Uganda, and she and her husband are doing great work in the schools down there. And we could relate because she's down there, and we could talk the same language. We could talk about the circumcision, and that heck, it means a heck of a lot. And 98% of people are doing it. It's not just they want to cut each other's vaginas. It means something. It means something because women are doing it to women. And we could relate, and it was one of the few times I didn't have to defend why I wasn't using a feminist perspective. Usually, if I say I'm not taking a feminist perspective, I will guarantee you 9 out of 10 times I'm asked, why aren't you taking a feminist perspective? And my response now is, I'll say something like, well, look at breast implants today. You get young girls getting breast implants. You don't call breast implants breast mutilation, but you call female circumcision female mutilation. That's your language. Why don't you do that, in your own country? And so, and I've been tough, and I've changed, but I'm having to be tough, and that's okay. But with women like that, we can dialogue about it because we're both ready to listen and talk and learn from each other, and I have a lot of learning to do too. So I think it depends on the case, and then I have a lot of learning to do. Well, when it's a mutual thing, it's pretty okay. But when it gets to the us-them thing, or what you're doing is inappropriate, or I just can't see how you're doing it, the women culture is oppressing a whole group of women because of a cultural tradition, then then it gets a little disappointing record.
I think it's a really important issue to bring up. How is it that how do we get along with other women of color as opposed to white feminists? Is it better? And I think that when we think about whiteness as an ideology and not as an ethnicity, then we can understand that there are many women of color who are deeply embedded and invested in whiteness, and who don't necessarily work for the liberation of groups of people, but for self-interest. So I've had some very disappointing experiences with women of color, where there was definitely the self, or perceived notions of a self became more important than being working to work together to make sure that that our issues of color were promoted rather than the individual interests. So that's why I'm really interested in whiteness as an ideology, not as an ethnicity, because I am interested in the way people of color perform whiteness, and often just for short-term gain.
Are there ways in which feminist theory, whether it's Western feminist theory or non-Western feminist theory, are there ways that it can inform these dialogues so that maybe they become more of what you were suggesting, more listening to, more bilateral, more equitable? What can we draw from feminism, regardless of its origin, to help us pull those connections?
Well, I think organizing this panel, which Christy put together today, some of us were a little nervous about coming today. They're heading self-righteous there. We were, and I talked about it yesterday with a friend, but I was really proud of this university for doing this and putting this panel together. It's the first time I've been somewhere where somebody has actually done this type of panel and looked at feminism this way. So I think this is an example of that discourse. One of the things we can do to learn from each other. Okay. Well, the
question you raise is what can Western feminism
Or any feminism.
Okay, any feminism, because historically when we look at, and I'm going to speak for the African American experience, African American women have seemed to inform Western feminism, liberal Western feminism, in terms of them not dealing with issues of race and class and sexuality. And so, and they basically have led the pack, so to speak, in terms of having Western feminism take a different standpoint or look differently at itself in terms of not just having a narrow view of addressing anti-sexist issues, but to look at the intersections of race and class. And I think that we need to continue with that kind of dialogue, and et cetera.
Because insofar as we're academic feminists, I think we sometimes fail to see how our academic ways of being white, and as you say, Carolina, it's not just whites, make it hard for us to see certain things, make it hard for us to act on certain things, incline us to focus on some things that will get us credit or that will move us ahead or whatever. And so I don't know that we can answer Lisa's question without problematizing the whiteness of academia. No matter how feminist you are, if you're academic, you have some of those investments.
I would have to agree with the way whiteness is perpetuated within the academy, because certainly we're not encouraged to collaborate with one another, but rather to compete for limited resources for those people who are willing to work with us. And often we have to go to other departments to get support for just being in a very alien place, such as the academy. I mean, I was the first one to graduate with from college, and I was the second to the youngest out of 7 children. So there's nothing before, and so we have to then reach out to different departments and different people. Because the people in our own departments are so interested in promoting their own research and taking care of number one, which is what they need to do to be successful. So the question I believe that was asked was how can we make it work, or what can we suggest to white feminists to create or promote change? I think that what we can learn from feminisms is the activism part of it. To be active, but not just in those things that will benefit you or your particular group, not just in white female interests, but to work in other groups. Because like other experiences that have been expressed here, I remember having an experience with a white woman who I didn't like her very much, but I could talk to her because she was so active in the Latino community. She had biracial children, and she had a vested interest to learn about their heritage, and so she participated and she read and she really did a lot of work to understand what exactly it would mean to raise a biracial, white and Latino children in this community. And because of that investment, then we could go to conferences and communicate almost at a meta level, where somebody would say something, and I knew that she was understanding what I was understanding, even though her experience was different from mine. So I guess it's really important, I think, that we be active and that we not just theorize about feminism in the textbook in the academy. Like I said, I'm a Chicana, and that entails responsibility to be out in the community and do something, even if it means postponing your academic career or not moving along as fast as people expect you to do. That's a sacrifice you have to make, and you're asking what you can do, and that's what I would recommend that you do.
I strongly agree with that we do need to be a part of organizations that is about the liberation of humanity.
And yet Audrey reminds us that as members of the Academy, and in a lot of other ways, we're members of hierarchically stratified societies. How much of sort of a hierarchy that's at least invested in whiteness, if not reproducing whiteness, how much of that hierarchy can we resist and or recoup as we're doing this activist work?
It was a struggle. and you know, it's part of the contradictions of being part of the Academy as well as being someone who, you know, is active in the community. You know, so it is
a question that was often asked, or some of us, I asked with friends, you know, as we were starting our academic careers, we said, can we do this? Can we live in this world? We'll you know, go up for tenure in 7 years, but what will have happened to us? Will we have lost our souls? How can we survive? How do we maintain a feminist commitment or an anti-racist commitment to social justice as we're socialized daily further and further into an ideology of whiteness or hierarchy of institutional structure?
That's a good question because I'm new too.
One day at a time, I guess.
I'm not sure how to think about that. I mean, it is, as Karen said, a struggle. Karen and I are both in the Education, Culture, and Society department, and part of what our department does is to work with teachers and teachers who are preparing to be teachers, to provide some new frameworks, some new forms of conceptualization, and so I think at least to that extent, some of the intellectual work we do is very important. It's useful. It's something that can be taken out and used. But we have to be careful of not fooling ourselves that, you know, everybody's sort of sitting around waiting for us to provide them with these tools. They're not. And sometimes the tools maybe even backfire. To a certain extent, one of the things I hear from some grad students is, well, now that we know about sort of the arrogance of whiteness, maybe we should just back off and not do anything. And that, I think, is that white desire to not be complicit, to not engage if you can't be making a change that everybody will sit around and applaud and say that's a good thing. So at the same time that I think we'll potentially provide some useful tools, the very academic understanding of these issues can work against the sense, yeah, we could do something. We could go out there and make a difference. It would be problematic, but it still would be working for change.
I like to think we're here because we think there's a reason for us to be here. Do you see white feminism or white feminists, well-intentioned white feminism or white feminists, as seeking to be inclusive in ways that might coerce women of color to assimilate, possibly silencing women of color or perpetuating context of oppression? It was actually on the list.
I think for African American women, historically, they have not allowed themselves to be silenced. When you look at the history of black women and activism from the antebellum era up into present, etc., African American women have basically formed their own organizations to struggle against our various forms of oppression. And so I don't think I'll buy into that question about whether or not white feminism have silenced us, because what it has done is allowed us to critique white feminism and engage in our own struggle, one that speaks to our experiences.
Yeah, I think Cook's kind of does a nice job talking about how sometimes social existence on margins, wherever, for whatever reason that's margins, almost forces a creativity in response, a creative resistance in response that's empowering to some degree.
Right, exactly.
thoughts. Do you feel coerced into silence, into assimilation?
I think assimilation is a really important question. I was recently, a white woman responded to my self-identification as a Chicana by saying that holding on to identity causes trauma and pain. And my response to her was that my Chicana identity is emerged from the violence of marginalization and assimilation, so being a Chicana is a way of surviving assimilation. And it's, as I've stated before, it's a source of solace and a place to belong. So I think that assimilation really is a critical construct or concept that we need to understand when we think about relationships between women of color, because there is often the pressure to assimilate, and yet my definition of assimilation is that it's not just a matter of choosing to assimilate. Dominant culture needs to invite you to do so, and if you're perceived to be unassimilatable by class or skin color or sexual preference, then you're not going to fit in, which is, I think, many of the reasons why Chicana lesbians had difficulty during the 1960s.
You should take the answer. Do well-intentioned white feminists seek to be inclusive and can coerce women of color? Yes, in some cases I think so. I don't know if it's necessarily white feminists. I think feminists. In some cases, in doing the best of intentions, I am one of them, was one of them. I started languaging circumcision as female genital mutilation. That was the language I was taught in the textbook. So guess what? That's how my dissertation started. And somewhere along the line it changed. I got my own voice, and I heard what the women were saying, the African women were saying, and to use their language. But the textbooks created me, the Western textbooks, and they were by women and men that were well-intentioned. What helped me along the way was having a nurturing group of people around me and colleagues in academia that let me have my voice and let me grow. So I think things can change. I think people do generally have well intentions. I think we all do. But we always have to be in check as to whose intentions are we serving and why.
Karen had made the point that we don't, that whites don't necessarily silence feminists and womenist of color, which I think is true. White feminists have been hearing for a long time that we're taking up too much time, we're taking up too much of the space, and so that feminists of color have been silenced in that, but they keep having to say that because white feminists keep not listening to that. And I think that it is more a matter of the amount of space and energy we take up, our need for approval or for recognition. And something that white feminists do, but I think that all groups do to a certain extent, is police one another. Look at one another and say, are you an authentic African American? Are you an authentic American Indian? What would come with that? And then position ourselves as judges so that we can't listen, because first we got to check out your credentials.
Bill brought up a lot of issues around the tensions and opportunities at work at the intersections of gender, race, and class. If we take various institutions, feminism, patriarchy, anti-racism, anti-homophobia, how can we draw on all those possible positions to build a theory of social justice, or even to take a small step towards social justice that is attentive to the complications you all identify? Where do you go? Fix the world.
Do we have that question on our list? A big one.
The audience can help us.
Yeah.
Let them have some.
Well, I think we do need to recognize that there needs to be a diversity of feminism, one that is responsive to the different needs and concerns of different women, and defined by them and themselves, like we talked about helping and circumcision. You know, that is basically bringing the circumcised to define that reality for themselves. So we need to first understand that there needs to be a diversity of feminism, and not see, something is wrong with that because we don't have one feminism. But yeah, so that's the first step.
We're in the position of we need the tools to build the anti-racist tools. We're not at a position yet of having the tools. We don't even have the tools we need to build the tools. But maybe if we think in those ways, rather than thinking we can fix it tomorrow, think what's the next step towards something else. And I don't know what that looks like, but I think that the activism part has to come back into it, in that as academics we tend to start from our thinking, and we need to move ourselves into different places, into different habits, into different relationships, different responsibilities, in order to be able to.
As Kadisha sort of suggests, we're not going to get it right very often, but we keep evolving so we get it more right. And she also suggests we alone don't have to fix the world. Let me open this up to you all for thoughts, questions, responses. Anyway.
I wanted to ask a little bit about the notion of Western feminism. So far, intentionally or unintentionally, we've been talking about Western feminism as a fixed idea. I was wondering, and being somebody who struggled within Western feminism, I would like you to talk about how does the notion of a fixed Western feminism serve or disserve some of your positions in your research, and how do you address the complexity of Western feminism as you start off in doing that?
I don't know that I necessarily think about feminisms in terms of a fixed Western feminist group. I am aware of the different feminisms that are at stake. So I guess the best way that I can address how it influences my research is that I'm constantly having to remind myself that there's a difference between white people and whiteness. So that's how I try to negotiate that tension. And why my focus is on people of color mostly, how they perform whiteness. So I'm not sure if I'm addressing your question in terms of fixing white feminism, because I don't feel like I do that.
Well, in the discussion, it's been referred to many times liberal white feminist, and I'm just saying that I've struggled with liberal white feminists myself, and so I'm wondering, in looking at deconstructing Western feminism, for instance, I did a radio show when I lived in Madison, Wisconsin, where it was a generational battle to a certain extent, but the feminist show that had existed previously, which was called Her Turn, wanted to meet with those of us who were creating Girly magazine to sort of go over make sure what we were doing was okay. So I'm just asking you to please address the complexity of that and how that may serve and disserve, what you're doing as well. So the kind of deconstructive work that you do within in starting your research based on the referencing to Western feminism.
I actually had to deal with that because when I was trying to find my theoretical model, okay, I'm coming with some lens, I'm looking at some issue, there's something, and there's some assumption that I have. So I started reading because I was, a lot of the work I had read was feminist. Which kind of feminism would suit me? And then I got confused because there were so many different kinds. And then finally, after reading everything, I just backed away from everything and I said, okay, what do I want to say? And I ended up they all helped me. Each part of it helped me, whether it be liberal or Marxist, they all did. But in the end, I didn't use the word feminism, though I give credit in my work there, in it, because I got lost in it. Maybe as a woman of color, maybe the same thing I heard over and over again was this language that was so strong, the language I used to use, But I thought maybe it's losing women of color in the process. So that's what happened to me. But I share your struggle. I can relate to that. Yeah.
Well, I guess I feel I have to deal with it more than I want to. I'm in a very conservative discipline, philosophy, and philosophy still works within that paradigm, and so I feel like I'm constantly trying to work against that, and I guess that might be part of what I can do as a white woman, is to challenge that. I mean, women of color have done that kind of work for a long time, but it does get boring.
Well,
It
you
gets
should
boring.
know too that there are parts of the real world. When you're talking about the academy may be hanging on to some of that. I'm not sure. You can speak more to that than I can. Maybe hanging on to some of that more than some of what's happening in the trenches.
Depends on,
Depends on
what
where
the
you
trenches
are.
are. I mean,
Depends-
if
yeah,
the
exactly.
trenches
There are
are
trenches.
public school classrooms, or if they're churches, those are pretty conservative places too. But yeah, you're right. I mean, it really depends on the specific locale.
On that note, I was wondering how these global or Western feminist and multicultural feminist ideologies, how different they are in this state, how some of those change or twisted in Utah and in our state society.
I think there's a degree to which there's almost a more passionate commitment to that. And that's how I've experienced, I think, here in Utah is, there's always a joy that I feel as a woman of color when I am in a community that's got a lot of people of color. There's like, oh my gosh, look. There's an excitement there. And I think what happens for me in Utah is that the relative scarcity of people of color, and then even smaller feminists of color, means there's more joy in each other's presence and in each other's ideas. There's no space for internal conflict or little space for that, and especially in these disruptive forms. But you all may have very different thoughts.
I have a question. I'm almost afraid to ask this. The identity of feminists, or the stances that you take, what is it? Is it just because you're a woman, or what is it? You know what I'm saying?
Well, as I've mentioned before, I see being a Chicana as a political term, and certainly there are Chicanos who actively work within the community along with me to promote equity and fairness. In the particular organization I'm working with right now in the judicial system. But I've also been on the Arts Council reviewing grant applications where there were people who came together and were really trying to make sure that the allocation of funding was going to needed areas. So I'm not so sure that, from my standpoint as a Chicana, that it's necessarily that you have to be a woman or that you have to be of Mexican American ancestry to do the type of work that I do.
So there is a distinction between a feminist and an activist, is there?
Well, I'm not making that distinction. All I'm saying is that it's redundant for me to say that I'm a Chicana feminist because Chicana is already a political term and feminist is a political term. I think that maybe it's just a matter of where that, the extent of activism that's entailed in that label. Some people take on that label and don't do anything at all in the community. And so that's why I qualified my responses earlier as I'm speaking from my perspective of what it means to me to be a Chicana, because there's certainly different definitions of Chicana or Chicano.
And I embrace a feminist discourse that looks at the struggle for liberation, human liberation, or the overall oppression, and that women do not necessarily have to be feminists. Men can also have that same type of ideology.
Okay, when you say feminist, what do you mean?
I look at feminism from my perspective is the struggle for liberation, is the struggle to overthrow all forms of oppression, multiple forms of oppression, be it race, class, gender, heterosexuality, ableism, etc. And so that's the type of feminism that I embrace, one that looks for that kind of, one that takes on that type of ideology.
So the dominant feminist doesn't take on those same perspectives or objectivity?
There's a variety of type of feminism. There's Western feminism, there's Black feminism, there's Chicana feminism, etc. And so there are some feminism that only look at some, like Western feminism have a narrow definition of feminist theory that looks at the struggle as only being a struggle, an intersexist struggle.
I'm curious. I don't know if there was a question or not, but one of the things lately that I've struggled with is like we talked about the female circumcision and women wearing the burqa, and how we kind of place our cultural ideology, white ideology, even on these other cultures and saying, well, that's bad. So I struggle with that because I don't see anything wrong with those things. That that's part of the culture and that's what they want to identify with. So my question then is, as we work with younger women, then should our goal as feminists, for lack of a better term, it seems, be to be reframing what we view, and if we're concerned with female circumcision, we shouldn't be so concerned that females are circumcising themselves, but rather the manner in which it's done, so that it's not, there's a difference between a child who gets circumcised in the village with a bottle and a woman who gets to go to a clinic and have it done in a sanitary and a medical way so that she doesn't have the complications. Is feminism then becoming more about reframing our experiences as women?
I think that's a great question. Just if I answer that quickly would be, is that I think in some ways we try to make that example one answer it too quickly, too simply. Within circumcision, there are 3 to 4 different kinds. Mm-hmm. So there's most of the world does the most minor kind. The most severe kind of fibulation is where there's complete cutting of the vagina. Is not done by most of the countries, but the way we talk about it is as though most of the countries are performing Form 4. So let's first get the languaging right before we jump the gun as to how many are going through it. And for many populations, they engage in the most minor kind, which is a symbolic cutting of the clitoral hood. Brings into the issue of why don't we call male circumcision male mutilation? You know what I mean? So as we dialogue about it, is maybe with our students, and I'm a student myself, is just look at, let's deal with the complexities and tackle some of those. Yeah, there are health consequences. There can be. We don't know how many or how severe. What has shut the research out in the medical field, which is how I met Kristen, was because many women won't talk to researchers or doctors or academics. So we even don't know how the health risks are because they've been so afraid by the way it's been labeled or perceived. So just by opening our dialogue, we might even find out more about the risks.
And I wanted to say that I was using female circumcision as an example, but I think that for reframing the issue, I wanted to be applied everywhere. So thank you.
Yeah. Does that help?
Yes.
I kind of feel like you do because I'm a real concrete person, and my question may be, or my statement may be simple. And so I'm a little nervous about it. Feminism to me has been an equality issue, a place at the table with an equal voice and able to recognize to someone able to make my own decisions. I recognize that there are many layers of that. And sitting here listening, I'm wondering if we, again, need to reframe the term feminism, that there needs to be another term, or maybe that's not current, and I just kind of want a response to that. Agree, disagree, is there a way to reframe it? I understand what being a Chicana adds another layer to what that means to have a seat at the table.
I really don't think, I think that if people just start, associating feminism with a negative thing, then I think that's problematic because, as was stated earlier, we wouldn't be here today if it weren't for the feminist movement. Whether, that feminist movement included people of color historically, no, it did not. That doesn't mean that we should throw it out, completely. I think what you are doing already is answering your own question. You're saying, I'm beginning to question what equality means and the different layers of equality, and as long as you start to question that, then I would suggest that if feminism means something to you, that you hold on to it. I'm holding on to my Chicana identity because of the historicity of how the term evolved, and because when I did a survey of feminisms, I didn't fit in any of them either. Where the term Chicana fits what I want to do. And I also, in my own community, experienced negative reactions to the term Chicana because in Texas, Chicana is a negative term. It means the lowest of the low. So it's not something that my family embraces, but I do. And it's what I use. And so I would recommend that if feminism is an important thing for you, that you keep it, but that you keep that critical lens of what it means to be a feminist. And so every time you have the impulse to look and fix what's going on in another country, you first look at what's going on in this country. Because I think that what happens is that a lot of people look at what's going on in other countries and in so doing avoid their implicature in perpetuating racism and classism in the United States.
Even to make it down to look at what we're doing in Utah. I mean, there's enough work in Utah.
Exactly.
I think one of the troubles that arises when we use a term like equality is we often use it rather literally. And so I've heard white feminists, for example, look at Black Baptist Church and say, women are not at the forefront. Women cannot be ministers. Therefore, that is the same kind of feminist issue as you might find in a Protestant white church that doesn't have white ministers. And not to say that there aren't feminist issues there, but they're not the same issues. The choices that are made in a Black Baptist church about how to support black men are different than the choices that are made in a white Baptist church about how to support white men. And so the danger in using a term like equality is we tend to think that the equality in this location is the same as the equality in that location, and it may not be the case.
I guess sort of speaking to that equality and taking it to a local level, how do you see being an activist? Could the three of you sort of come to what kind of coalition of sorts would you all be at together, do you think, here locally?
Well, I mean, like I said, I'm involved with this task force, this commission, and the advisory council that's investigating the judicial system. And believe me, not everyone on that council is a feminist, much less a Chicana. But we still have the same concerns. So I'm speaking from my perspective as a Chicana and the need for activism. So I think that regardless of what that activism is, that you can work with other people. The problem is, like, for example, I had a discussion with an ecofeminist who told me, we need to come into solidarity. I don't really care what your experiences are as a woman of color, and we shouldn't have to care about those issues as long as we can understand that without protecting the environment, we're all going to be in trouble, right? And I told her, why should I trust you if you don't care about me, So that's problematic for solidarity. I think it's really important that we understand the difference in feminism. One of the major things is that different groups look at what's wrong with our culture, and so they look at patriarchy, some look at whiteness or white supremacy, others look at different reasons for inequality, right? And they're all valid reasons, and that there isn't any reason for us to say, no, you're wrong, my perspective is right. That we learn to embrace, okay, you have the right to believe what you believe in, and I support you. I support liberal feminist but only to the extent that you don't try to speak for me. And as long as you're not trying to speak for someone and you're really interrogating your life and how you might be perpetuating the very things that you espouse to believe in, then I think that it doesn't matter who you work with, that you can work collectively together for a future project.
I guess what I hear you saying, that part of your feminisms, your multiple feminisms, is this incredibly careful reading of the sign, that you are scholars of the signs and the histories of the signs, and yet on top of that, adding a whole other layer of complication, is that you have your own experiences with the signs, as we all do. That in other words, Carolina's experience with the sign Chicana is going to be very different than somebody else's experience of that. And Audrey's got an experience of wearing a sign as a white Anglo woman. And part of the difficulty as we work with each other and with our students is to explain all those different levels of crudity, complication, history, and then experience beyond that. And I think a lot of confusion, at least in my experience with feminism, comes in right there. Is that at times we think somebody's talking about an experience when they're talking about a sign, and how do we pull those apart, but also understand sometimes how they're so deeply wedded to each other that that's where our investment is extreme, and sort of rightfully so. And it seems to me that that's one of the things I've heard you say today, sort of performing those levels of complication as you try to help us understand what these different, feminisms might mean. So a comment, but feel free to dissect that or correct that.
Well, I think that my Chicana identity is definitely a deliberate re-articulation of what it has meant in the past, and it's an ongoing articulation of bringing together what it has meant in the past and what I make of it on an individual basis. And I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing, and I don't really think it's something that I need to take apart as I present myself and as I struggle as a Chicana. I understand the need to explain it to other people, and there's always the history, in the same way that you would try to teach liberal feminism, Marxist feminism, post-colonial feminism, all those things. There, with the Chicana, it starts with the Chicana movement, and so in terms of maybe trying to explain how it is that the individual experience then connects with that, I think maybe it's not really something that you need to do, because we can speak for ourselves. You should invite me as a speaker.
I'm always happy to have you.
Maybe I can just make one, that was such a great comment that you said. Maybe what we can do is some of the things that we have read, I don't know if you can get an email list or something, we can share with you, I can put down, I'm sure we all could, some of the things that have helped us in our journey. There are great books now also on global feminism, different books or things that I have read or other people have read. And if you have things that have helped you as well that you think would help us, we could maybe, set up an email and stay in touch again, because we care about this as much as you do, and keep this dialogue going. That's an idea. Let's do something about it.
I think you pointed to something very important, Catherine. I'm talking about performing, and it may be especially salient for whites to perform and to model our deconstruction and rearticulation of how we're thinking through things, how we're constructing them. But I also see white students of color doing that. I also see them starting to say something like, as an African American student, I think, and then sort of looking around at the other African American students and saying, there's multiple positions here, and rethinking that, and talking that through so that it becomes material to work with rather than an essentialized position. But at the same time, I understand and I respect Carolina's position that it's that shouldn't be an obligation of students and scholars of color to make that available to other people.
I just slipped my mind what I was going to say. Okay, give me a second. Okay, repeat part of your question again, or your statement.
Well, I guess I was just sort of saying that one thing I found very powerful in your collective comments was working on so many different levels of this problem, and that I think, again, in teaching, often students just imagine that they maybe understand there's something about labels, so something kind of goes on about labels, and then they hear the word experience, and they keep either collapsing the two too directly or pulling them apart too far, and yet so many of your comments have been very helpful and very carefully calibrated to hold the two together, but to understand their difference at the same time, which I think is where the difficult work of critical race theory lies, and understanding that a label is different than an experience, and yet often what we're talking about is our very intense experience with labels. So intense that we can't even remember when that label was ever put upon us, because it feels like we're wedded to that. And trying to speak to that sort of careful moment of attachment between label and experience strikes me as something very difficult to do.
Well, for me, the label black feminist is definitely, I don't see the difference between the two. My label is tied to my experiences as well as the experiences of black women that came before me. And I embrace the two. I don't see a difference between the two. When I look at a long history of struggle, and then when I look at my own experiences with, like I said, racism, classism, sexism, etc., I still embrace those labels and those experiences together. It's not disconnected from it.
We are out of time, but I'd like to thank you all for coming. And thank you.